marching home again. Hurrah, hurrah. We'll give him a hearty welcome then. Hurrah, hurrah. And the men will cheer and the boys will shout. The ladies, they will all turn out, and we'll all be glad when Johnny comes marching home. The old church bell will peal with joy. Hurrah, hurrah, to welcome home our darling boy. Hurrah, hurrah, the village lads and lassies say, with roses they will strew the way, and we'll all feel glad when Johnny comes marching home.
Bob, I'm sure that you know that on this Vietnam War Memorial, in the black marble, there are carved nearly 60,000 names of Vietnam soldiers, our men, who gave their lives in that war. That's serious, isn't it?
Yes, Chaplain Ray, it is serious. Many of those names I knew personally. One of those names, as you know, a lieutenant named Keogh, I dedicated my book Tailwind to. So when I look at those names, the death, the symbol of death that that wall represents is there, but also I think in my heart they're home to rest, and there's some other Vietnam veterans that aren't yet home to rest.
Yes.
So I remember now more than the dead. I remember now the living.
You and I both remember in a very special way the many thousands of Vietnam veterans that are in our prisons. In some of our adult prisons, it is estimated that 1 out of every 4 prisoners is a Vietnam veteran.
As you know, those figures come alive to me every month as I travel into prisons throughout the United States. Last year to over 60 prisons, where I spoke with inmates from one coast to the other. And the Vietnam veterans do identify themselves, most having read my book that you have given to the prisons throughout the country. And there's another Vietnam vet statistic. It's said now that over 50,000 Vietnam veterans have committed suicide since it all began. So from the ones that have given their lives in combat that are listed here, to the ones that have lost their lives in confusion and misery and sorrow, to the ones that still aren't home from Vietnam that are in our prisons, it is heavy, Chaplain Ray.
Yes. Yes, it really is. And of course, as you know, when you came home, you didn't have 30 days on a boat like soldiers have in previous wars. You were brought home in more like 30 hours, right out of Vietnam, landing here near our nation's capital, waiting there in the snow on a stretcher. That was a quick change from Vietnam to America.
I don't think we were prepared for the homecoming. In other words, we were trained for Vietnam, we were trained for the war, but we were never detrained, and we were never detrained to come home and to have a buffer. When we look at the bronze memorial and we look at the boots, many of our boots, as we got off the planes from Vietnam, still had mud in them from their jungles. It was so quick, the transaction from combat to home.
So many of the men that came back from Vietnam, they were still there emotionally, they were still there in the fighting mood. Many of them were still heavily engaged with drugs, and they just weren't ready to meet the things that were waiting for them in a country that let them come home without a parade?
I think without a parade sums it up. We didn't expect a parade with ticker tapes, but we expected an acceptance upon our return, some type of acknowledgement of a job well done, even if nobody understood the job or why the job was being done. For the men that lay here, whose names are listed here, they did the job the best they could, and we recognize that. But coming home and facing the peace, for me, was more difficult than the war. Every Vietnam veteran who's incarcerated today, be it a mental hospital or a prison, has never had a parade, probably never will have a parade. And I don't think he's home yet from the war.
For takeoff. Roger, 627.
Well, Captain, when you came home, you had one advantage. You were medevaced home quickly, and then your hospital stay was like a buffer to help you to adjust and prepare for your ongoing life. Many veterans didn't have that. And of course, you and I both know some veterans who've had great careers since their return. Men like Governor Carey, who's a Vietnam veteran, a Medal of Honor winner, a Navy SEAL, and achieved the high office of the Governor of Nebraska. I imagine if you made a quick trip back from Vietnam, it was probably quite a transition even for you.
Well, it's a bit of one, yeah.
Yes.
Because I went directly from combat into a hospital, which is a nice little buffer to have before you end back up on the streets.
Yes.
So, and was older.
Yes.
I was 25 years of age and college graduate and didn't quite face the transition that an awful lot of 18, 19-year-old young men did, going directly into combat, right back into the streets. So I had a little easier time in many ways, and I'm grateful for it.
Yes. And of course, you know that we have a very large number in some of our prisons of veterans, mostly the Vietnam War, but of some other wars. And we've devoted a lot of attention the last year or two to trying to find some affirmative programs that'll really help them. And of course, the changing attitude in America toward the Vietnam veteran is a contributing factor, because at long last, our country is giving some of the honor that is really due to those men and has been due to them for many years.
I think that'll help.
I think
that'll help. Although the toughest part for any individual is to ask fundamental questions about what's the purpose, why work hard right now. I mean, you get out of prison, or you get out of the service, or you just stand here today in the current moment. It's you've got to link through things other than experiences in Vietnam or wealth or anything like that in order to make some contact with the future.
The buffer that Governor Carey spoke about, the buffer that I had, that he had, that Ronald Bartee had, and so many successful veterans had, I believe was what was missing in the lives of the Vietnam veterans that I've met and talked to in prisons all over the United States. There was no buffer. My buffer was actually drug-induced by the Army, because they kept me heavily sedated while they debrided the wound. And so I wasn't able to deal with reality until the hospital stay was over, and by that time I was transferred to Germany to command an A-team. And you know, I learned something through that experience and through working with veterans in prison. Many of the men that got in trouble on drugs didn't really start their drugs in Vietnam. So many of them knew nothing about drugs and never touched them there. But when they came home, they were so confused that many times they sought out drugs and alcohol as a way to come down, as a buffer. And many times the veterans organizations prescribed drugs for them to help them cope. Men like Ronald Bartee, another winner.
Yes.
Youngest parole commissioner in the United States. Head of the parole board of Nebraska, another Vietnam veteran. His buffer, he went back to school and studied and worked hard.
And I'm sure you can relate. There are times when you can just sit down by yourself and it's just like yesterday that you were there. And that was the part we talked about earlier about the transition. The transition just was not made for the Vietnam vet to come back to the States, because we don't need those skills anymore. The desire that we utilize to survive and come home and then channel it towards a career in our life It's just that making that transition to drop those weapons. You don't need them, but it's tough to drop them.
Of course, it's tough to drop them, particularly if you were 19, you were home in 36 hours.
That's right.
You went right back to the same slum you started from.
Exactly.
But there were a few stolen M16s laying around. And the next thing you know, somebody handed you one, peer pressure, and says, let's go take on that gas station, and you did it.
Exactly.
And, of course, you'd use that same M16 to stay alive in Southeast Asia. That's one major problem. Another major problem is stress, how people react under stress. They taught us how to react. Either you're going to kill somebody or they're going to kill you.
That's right.
Now, what happens under stress to young men who, 10 years after the fact, forgot about all those skills, and somebody threatens them? And what I find so often with a Vietnam vet in prison is overreaction.
That's right.
Some guy, beat him in the head with a Coke bottle and then was walking away, and he shoots him, because the fight's still going as far as he's concerned.
That's right.
Time after time, overreaction. And from my experience, if they don't have a Christian experience at some point in their prison experience, they're coming back.
Exactly.
Do you find, though, that when men, Vietnam veterans, are coming out of the system on parole or whatever, do you get a scary feeling inside, or do you ever find that you know in your heart that they're not home yet? They've done their time, but they're not home yet, and that they're coming back into the system for sure?
That is something that I guess I have nightmares about. Any individual that we decide to parole them, you hope that this individual really can make it out there. If anything, the last thing you want to do is bring that individual back. But if he's in a position where he starts threatening society, you have to bring the man back.
And of course, that's why Captain Robert Van Burskirk and I are here with you at this time, because we'll be in your state penitentiary here in Lincoln, Nebraska, and we'll be doing a special film and videotape on veterans incarcerated.
Please visit the Vet Club there, because they have a very progressive club going now.
We're having a rap session with the veterans there tonight,
Okay.
and the cameras are going to be rolling for it. Bob, you've already met some of the vets here, haven't you?
Yes, sir.
What happened when you met with them?
Well, I shared with them, and they shared with me, and I sensed a lot of anger, a lot of pain, and a lot of frustration. And I forgot that when I was in prison in Germany, I felt the same way. I'm sitting there thinking, what are these guys so mad about? And why are they so hurt and frustrated? They did something to get into prison, right? But I just I'd forgotten just how angry you can be. And then I realized that, of course, some of them are still in Vietnam, mentally. They're still in Saigon. They're not home yet. All right, I want you men to see this T-shirt. You stand up, please. Participant, Southeast Asia War Games, 2nd place. How about that? Now, the United States might feel that way, but a lot of the men that were with me in Special Forces, and I'm sure a lot of them in this room, we don't believe 2nd place. That's just what the general public might feel, right?
Right.
The tragedy of war, when you start to study it in its history, is that the men that declare it aren't the men that fight. And the tragedy of Vietnam, for me, was to learn that the men that declared it and kept it going for 5 government generations, let's say, their own sons figured out a way to beat the draft. And very few of the men that kept this war going, for the many generations that it kept going for Vietnam, contributed their own blood to it, or their own children. But America contributed hers. But it's been that way in every war. The last war where the general that declared it fought it was Hannibal. And the tragedy of war, at least in this country and in Vietnam, was that Vietnam only took our best. We didn't say, oh, that guy's got bad, what we did say was, that guy's got bad knees or bad back from football, he can't go. And what we said was, here are America's very best, very most alert, very most healthy. And of course, most of the young men volunteered. And then we put them on a battlefield, which we never recognized as a battlefield. We called it a policing action. And for those of us that went, for those of us that were trained and maybe didn't go but were ready to go, we know in our hearts that was no policing action. That was a real, honest-to-God war. And the judges that decided it was 2nd place, I don't think they ever went over and took a good look at the game, because they might have been hurt. And those of us that did play the game for them, and they claimed us 2nd place, when we came home, the tragedy, the real tragedy is they blamed the warriors and not the men that declared it.
I never got into the military, and I have a lot of respect for all the guys that did. And I hope that what we're producing here is going to be meaningful to every veteran that's in a prison in this country where they show this, and practically all of them will show it. But I can tell you just like there's a growing awareness out here in the public that the guys coming back from NAM got a bad deal, and that it's time for somebody to, to come forward and say the things that should have been said a long time ago. Robert Van Buskirk and I thank you for letting us come. From the day that Bob and I met, we had a lot of common cause and common ground, common interest. And our International Prison Ministry, which now publishes 1 million books a year that we give free to prisoners, such as God's Prison Gang, Last the Bonnie and Clyde Gang, The Enforcer, Holes in Time, Where Flies Don't Land, these and many more. We were privileged to publish his story, Tailwind. And I can tell you that that book, Tailwind, has meant a lot to a lot of guys in prisons all over this land. We want to share with you your hurts, and we want to share with you your hopes and your dreams, and pray that they'll all be fulfilled, and that the worst of your tomorrows will be better than the best of all your yesterdays. We never give up, fellas. As long as there's life, there's hope. And there's nothing that's more wonderful than to see a guy get out of one of these joints and get back with his family and get back on the streets and have such good things happen that it eases a lot of the hurts and pains and memories. You know, Bob did a year in a German prison. He probably knew more about weapons than any man in Europe at the time. They rewarded him for Vietnam by giving him a tour of duty in Germany. And that's when the terrorists were running wild, and so they suspected him of providing the weapons for the terrorists. And so they held him for a year, solitary confinement in a tough prison. And finally, they couldn't make a case against him, and so they had to let him go.
This solitary cell in Lincoln, Nebraska, reminds me very much of the military stockade cell where I was first put in Germany when I was first arrested. It had a door like that. It was actually smaller. It had a toilet and sink, very similar. And I spent 2 months of my life there. And then I was moved to a solitary confinement cell, which was without the steel bars. It was a solid steel door you couldn't see out. And I had some small bars on one side. And I spent 10 months in solitary there. And finally, I was moved to another German prison for 2 months, or a little less. And it was about the size of this cell, again with a solid steel door. It's been said that prison walls do not, or prison bars do not a prison make. And that people that have an alcohol problem or a drug problem or a bad marriage, they're in a prison. And that may be true. However, when you're in a real prison, and you know you might spend the rest of your life there, you're in a different environment that only people that have been there can understand. The one thing that remains in my subconscious thoughts about prison is that all the anger and all the hate, for whatever reason that you found yourself there, will focus itself into this room if you're a prisoner, and you'll have to live with these ghosts and live with this anger. And I think the most difficult task any prisoner has is to learn how to give that anger and get that anger away from this cell. And the tragedy is there's really no way to get it out of this cell except through the Christian experience. The statistics show that the repeat offender rate, or recidivism, is 60 to 80%. And it's my belief it's the anger and the hatred in the hearts of the men and women in prison that brings them back again and again. And it wasn't until I was able to take that hate list or that anger in my own heart and give it to God in prayer that this prison no longer held me. And that's very important, and I remember that. The day that I became a Christian and the day that God took my anger and hate from me is the day that those bars disappeared. And it's a day that I realized that the only thing the Germans had in that prison cell was a body. They had my body, but they didn't have me, that part of me which I knew is personal. And that's the terrific good news about the Christian relationship, is that even if you're in behind these bars, once you acknowledge your Creator, and once He touches you, these bars are no longer there.
You fellas have every reason in the world to be proud. I said, you fellas have every reason in the world to be proud. I was proud of my kid brother when he was in the service. I was proud of him when he came home. I was proud of our son when he enlisted in the Air Force. Proud of him when he came home. And the fact that you're on this side of the fence doesn't make a bit of difference when it comes to real things like this. I'm proud of every man here. And I hope you'll always be proud of yourself. You have every right to be.
And learning to understand that the Vietnam vet, all 9 million of us, are one big family, whether we drew enemy fire or not. And that we got to stay together, whether we're in prison or not. That's the key.
I still feel a sense of guilt about the Vietnam War, and millions of Americans still feel a sense about the war itself and the way that we neglected and mistreated our veterans when they came home.
My father felt the same way until the day he died. He felt a sense of confusion and guilt, and he was there, as you know, almost to the very end as a soldier.
His father was in the Air Force, in World War II, in the Korean thing, and in Vietnam. With that kind of a tradition, a man who came home from the Vietnam War with all kinds of decorations and Purple Hearts, you would think that he would come home and enjoy a lifetime of memories, of honor, of security. But what the government did, they sent him to Germany to give him a tour of duty in Europe as a reward for his valiant service in Vietnam. And because Robert Van Buskirk was the most knowledgeable man in Germany when it came to weapons and arms and explosives, the Germans suspected him of supplying the arms for the terrorists. And then they buried him in an isolation cell and only allowed him out 15 minutes a day for a little bit of exercise in the yard, where he walked in circles with the terrorists on an Easter morning when it looked like the Germans would never let him go, though they hesitated to press the case because they didn't have a good case against him. He had a strange experience. He was standing by the door of his cell, waiting for the door to open, and he would go out for 15 minutes of exercise, walking in circles in the yard. And suddenly, he was transported somewhere else. And he went back in time. He could tell by the dusty road he was on and by that big old walled city there beside him. He could tell that he was back in time and space. And then he saw a crowd coming and a man who was carrying something over his shoulder, and it drug on the ground behind him because the man was carrying a cross. And Robert Van Buskirk realized he was seeing the reenactment of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And in a moment's time, his whole world changed. From that moment until this moment and forevermore, his whole life is focused on Jesus Christ. And Christ is everything to him. But the greatest treasure he'd ever found in his life, he found in a prison cell in Mannheim, Germany.
Because Christ died and is willing to save anybody. Now, guys, something happened in Vietnam. It was called triage. When we came back off a mission, we had people shot full of holes. The medics came out immediately and divided them into 3 groups. Those that were critically wounded and who weren't going to make it, they put red tags on them. They didn't spend any more time with them because they were lost. The ones in the middle had yellow tags. They would maybe make it, so they worked on them as much as they could. And the guys they put green tags on, they put them on me 5 times. Those were the ones that had slight wounds. We were going to make it regardless. Then they focused on that middle group. By the time I was sitting in Stamheim, I knew I had a red tag on me. I knew I was lost. I was a goner. And nobody cared. The Army said, I'm a goner. He's finished. And on Easter morning, I prayed for the first time. Now, I've told you before about my hate list. I had a good hate list, a justifiable hate list. And I tried to pray, and all I got was my hate list. So finally I said, God, if you exist, here's my hate list. You take it. You gave me whatever it is that helps me hate. I gave him my hate list, and I was able to continue to pray. I prayed for my mother, my father, and my sister, and myself. Now, I prayed for freedom. I wanted that door, that steel door to open, and I wanted to walk out of that prison and never go inside again. I wanted to come home to the United States forever because you were willing to go to Vietnam and do what your country asked you to do, and you came back for whatever reason, confused. Society is not going to take the red tag off you. Only Christ will take it off you. Society put it on you. Why should they take it off you? As your rap sheet grows, the tag gets redder and redder. A relationship with Christ goes from red to yellow. You might make it. And as you walk with Christ every day, it goes from yellow to green. It's no quick fix. It's no presto whammo. It's a daily struggle. It's unconventional warfare. Now, that's one thing I know. And a lot of you know unconventional warfare. You veterans that are wearing the veteran hats, you veterans that are wearing the Jesus buttons, that's unconventional in here, isn't it? Quite unconventional. You men that dare carry a Bible through this compound, I see a man with a Bible back there. That's a little bit unconventional too, isn't it? In this world today, I am convinced, and in this place, it's the sissies who don't accept Christ. It's the wimps that say, no, I ain't going to give it all up. I'm hanging on to my dope, man. I'm hanging on to my pervert sexual attitude. I'm hanging on to my being a pimp. I'm hanging on to being an armed robber. That's the sissies. That's the wimps. The true unconventional soldier hangs on to this in a relationship with Christ, and he lets all else go down. God bless you.
Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah. Give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer and the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out and we'll all feel glad when Johnny comes marching home. The old church bell will peal with joy, hurrah, hurrah. Welcome home, our darling boy, hurrah, hurrah. The village lads and lasses sang with roses, they will strew the way and we'll all feel glad when Johnny comes marching home. Get ready for the Jubilee, hurrah, hurrah. We'll give the hero 3 times 3, hurrah, hurrah. The laurel wreath is ready now to place upon his loyal brow. We'll all feel glad when Johnny comes marching home.